The West is dying, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Cultures, civilizations, and inevitable decline. That's according to Oswald Spengler, a German historian who shook the world with his book, Decline of the West. He said that civilizations don't rise and fall randomly. They follow a biological pattern, and it's as inevitable as the seasons, as predictable as the cycle of any organism. And Western civilization, despite all its technological power and global dominance, is entering its final stage, the winter of its cultural soul. So here is where Spengler is very important to our story. He predicted this decline, but then he explained exactly what this decline would look like, who would benefit from it, and what kind of political arrangements will emerge when cultures exhaust their creative possibilities. And his analysis of how democracy gives way to what he calls as Caesarism is playing out in real time before my and your eyes. The morphologist of history. So Oswald Spengler is sitting in his study in Munich. He's surrounded by artifacts from every civilization he can lay his hands on. Egyptian scriptures, Chinese paintings, Aztec codices, and manuscripts. He's looking at these isolated objects, or even examples of artistic development. He reads them like a naturalist reads fossils. He searches for the deep patterns that reveal how cultures are born, grow, mature, and die. What Spengler discovered was that history isn't linear progress towards some ultimate goal. It's cyclical, organic, morphological. Cultures are living beings within their own souls, their own destinies, their own inevitable life cycles, and each culture begins with a unique spiritual vision that generates from its art, religion, and political forms. But each culture will also exhaust its creative possibilities and hardens into what Spengler calls a civilization. This is a mechanical, materialist, cosmopolitan phase that marks the beginning of the end. You can't prove or disprove a theory like this through any rational argument. It's kind of like a way of seeing, a morphological intuition that reveals patterns invisible to conventional historical thinking. Either you can see the organic unity that connects a Gothic cathedral to a Beethoven symphony, to the structure of German philosophy, or you can't. Either you can recognize the winter signs of cultural exhaustion in contemporary art and politics, or you will remain trapped in the illusion of endless progress. Spengler has never tried to convince skeptics through evidence or argument. What he does is speak to those who already sense the decline, but lack a conceptual framework to understand what they're experiencing, like you. Cultures versus civilizations. Spengler's critical distinction is between culture and civilization. A culture is a living, organic entity with its own unique culture and symbol. Egyptian culture expressed itself through the pyramid, the symbol of eternal, unchanging existence. The classical culture of Greece and Rome expressed themselves through the nude statue, a symbol of a perfectly proportioned and finite body. The Western culture, which Spengler called Faustian, expresses itself through infinite space. Gothic cathedrals that reach toward the heaven, mathematical concepts of infinity, and the will to conquer unlimited territories. Sounds like Nietzsche. Each culture created its own art, its own religion, and its own mathematics. Then, its own politics based on the fundamental symbol and spiritual vision. During the cultural phase, everything is organic, creative, and meaningful. People know who they are, what they believe, and how they fit into a larger cosmic order. But eventually, these cultures will exhaust their creative possibilities and transform into a civilization. Civilization is what happens when the cultural soul dies, but the external forms continue. Art becomes technique, religion, philosophy, and politics becomes administration. Everything is mechanical, rational, and then cosmopolitan. Perhaps the clearest sign of this transition is the emergence of great cities, he said. They drain the countryside of their population and their vitality. In the world cities, people lose their connection to blood and soil and tradition. Then they become rootless cosmopolitans focused on money and comfort and their individual pleasure rather than on any higher spiritual purpose. Sound familiar? According to Spengler, Western culture began around 1000 AD, when the emergence of Gothic architecture, scholastic philosophy, and the crusading spirit birthed. For nearly 1,000 years, this Faustian soul expressed itself through an unprecedented explosion of creativity. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. Even the age of exploration and colonization. But by Spengler's time, when he was writing after World War I, the West had already transitioned what he said from a culture to a civilization. Our creative phase was over. And then what remained was a technological power, but lacking spiritual direction. We had global dominance, but no cultural meaning, and material prosperity, but no purpose. So the symptoms of this transition are everywhere. We replace religion with science, and we replace aristocratic honor with bourgeois money values, and the replacement of organic communities by bureaucratic states. And art is replaced by entertainment, philosophy by journalism. Most tellingly is the replacement of politics by administration. In a living culture, politics is about fundamental questions about how humans should live together. What values should we have to guide society? What kind of people do we want to become? But in a dying civilization, politics is about managing competing interest groups, optimizing economic growth, and maintaining social stability. Democracy as decay. This is where Spengler's analysis becomes quite politically explosive. Democracy isn't a sign of political progress, but a symptom of cultural exhaustion. When a culture is alive and vital, it wouldn't vote on fundamental values because those values would already be shared by everyone who participates in the cultural or spiritual life. Democracy emerges precisely when that spiritual unity between the people break down. When different groups within the same civilization no longer share the same basic assumptions about reality and meaning and value and religion. So at that point, politics becomes a marketplace where different interests compete for resources and power. Democracy is fundamentally unstable because it's based on the fiction that all opinions are equally valid and that complex social problems can be solved through rational debate and majority vote, when in reality, the masses don't have the knowledge, the attention span, or the spiritual development necessary to make these decisions about their governance. So democratic societies develop what Spengler calls the dictatorship of money. Real power doesn't rest with voters or even elected officials, but in the hands of those who control the financial and media systems that shape public opinion. Sounds familiar? Democracy becomes a theater where the masses choose between options that have been pre-selected by our oligarchical elites. Even this pseudo-democratic phase is temporary. Eventually, the contradictions become too obvious to ignore. The system becomes too corrupt to maintain legitimacy, and conditions ripen for the emergence of what Spengler calls Caesarism. Caesarism is Spengler's term for the final political form that emerges in dying civilizations. Not traditional monarchy or aristocracy, which would be in the cultural phase, and it's not democracy, which is in the early civilizational phase, but the rule of strong individuals who bypass formal institutions and appeal directly to the masses through personal charisma and the promise of order. The historical Caesar is the prototype, a military leader who used popular support to overthrow the Roman Republic and establish his personal rule. But Spengler sees Caesarism emerging in every civilization during its final phase. So Napoleon was a Caesar, and so were the various military strongmen in the declining phases of other civilizations. A crucial point to acknowledge is that Caesarism isn't an accident or a deviation from a normal political development, but an inevitable result of democracy's internal contradictions. When formal institutions lose legitimacy, and when the money power becomes too obvious, social conflict will intensify, and eventually beyond what democratic procedures can manage. Then people will naturally, or out of necessity, turn to strong leaders who promise to cut through the complexity and restore order. Spengler isn't presenting this as a good or bad thing, but just what happens when we enter our final phase. The Caesars might be brutal, or benevolent, or competent, or incompetent, but their emergence is as inevitable as winter following autumn. Race and culture. Now, for Spengler, race was a deeper biological category. It's a spiritual one. Each culture creates its own race through centuries of shared spiritual development. The people who participate fully in a culture's soul become racially unified, not just through genetics or blood, but through their common participation in the culture's deepest values and symbols. This means that biological ancestry is less important than spiritual affinity. A Japanese person who fully understands and embodies Western classical music is more racially Western in Spengler's sense than a European who has lost all connection to his own cultural tradition, in spiritual terms. Yet this also means that multiculturalism in the modern sense is impossible. How could you participate meaningfully in multiple cultures simultaneously if each culture has an incompatible worldview and a unique way of experiencing space and time and meaning? What passes for multiculturalism in our contemporary societies is actually the absence of culture, the cosmopolitan mixing of different characters in the civilizational phase. When different populations with different cultural backgrounds are forced together in the same political system, the result is not cultural enrichment, it's destruction. The living cultures are degraded into tourist attractions and ethnic restaurants, while the shared public space becomes dominated by the purely material concerns of economic production and consumption. Spengler sees a huge tension between world cities and countrysides, really one of the clearest indicators of civilizational decline. In the cultural phase, cities and countries exist in an organic relationship. The cities serve as centers for the culture's spiritual and intellectual life, while the countryside provides the blood and soil that keep culture vital. But during the civilizational phase, the world cities become parasites. They drain the countryside of its best people and concentrate them into cosmopolitan environments that cut them off from their cultural roots. The result is a spiritual sterility disguised as sophistication. Then the people who remain in the countryside, they are connected to the culture's deeper resources, but they're lacking the intellectual and political power to influence the direction of their civilization. While at the same time, the cosmopolitan elites who control these world cities have all the power and no spiritual connection that would cause them to use it effectively. This creates a political dynamic, and Spengler sees this playing out in every dying civilization. It's the tension between cosmopolitan elites and provincial population, as well as those who benefit from the civilizational phase and those who suffer from it. Really, fundamentally between those who embrace the future and those who remember the past. So Spengler isn't anti-technology in a simple sense. He just thinks that the relationship between technology and culture can be deeply problematic. In the cultural phase, technology serves these spiritual purposes. Gothic architecture used engineering to create spaces for religious experience. Classical mathematics serves philosophical contemplation of eternal forms. But in the later phase, technology becomes autonomous. It develops according to its own logic rather than serving any higher spiritual purpose. People become servants of their own technological systems. They adapt their lives to the demands of efficiency and optimization rather than using this technology to serve their own flourishing. This is very obvious in the relationship between human beings and our economic systems. In a living culture, economic activity serves our cultural and spiritual goals. The creation of beautiful objects, which maintains our traditional ways of life and supports activities that gives our life meaning. But in our dying civilization, we serve the economic activity. People are adapting their entire lives to the demands of global markets, systems, and bureaucratic organizations. This is backwards, and they become what Spengler calls economic animals, which are creatures whose entire existence is defined by production and consumption. The return of history. Lucky for us, Spengler doesn't end with decline and death. He understands that the end of one cultural cycle creates the conditions for new cultural beginnings. The West may be dying, but other cultures, particularly Russia and possibly others in the East, may be entering their springtime phase. Moreover, even within our dying civilization, there are always some people who maintain connection to deeper sources of meaning and vitality. These people must not try to preserve the civilizational process. That's impossible. Instead, what we should do is preserve what's worth preserving and prepare the ground for whatever comes next. This requires something Spengler calls as Prussian socialism. It's not Marxist and it's not really collectivism, but it's individuals who understand their duty within the larger historical process. So it is collective, but they don't expect to restore the cultural phase. They maintain order and excellence during the civilizational transition. So why should you understand Spengler for contemporary politics? Because he provides the most sophisticated framework for understanding the relationship between decline and politics. Every symptom he identified in the early 20th century has intensified. The dominance of money, hollowing of democracy, and the tension between cosmopolitan elites and provincial populations. We now have the emergence of charismatic leaders who are bypassing formal procedures. When you hear people say globalism and nationalism, when they analyze the rise of populist movements, and when they worry about the breakdown of democratic norms, they're unconsciously using Spengler's categories. The globalists represent the money power and cosmopolitan civilization that Spengler called the characteristic of cultural decline. These nationalists are representing the attempt to restore some connection to the blood, soil, and cultural tradition. But Spengler tells us that both sides are misunderstanding what's happening. The globalists think they're building a better future through rationalism and technological progress. The nationalists think that we can restore our golden past through political action. But both of these are trapped in linear thinking, and they miss the cyclical nature of cultural development. The choice that isn't a choice. So, from a Spenglerian perspective, the fundamental political choice isn't between left and right, globalism and nationalism, or progress to react to. It's between accepting this morphological reality of where we are in our cultural cycle and not being trapped about illusions for what's possible. If Spengler is right, the West is going to experience Caesarism regardless of what anyone wants or tries to prevent. Sorry, the question isn't whether this will happen. It's how does someone like you maintain honor, dignity, and excellence, however that's possible within this transition. No, you don't need to accept decline, but understand the difference between what can be changed and what can't be changed. You don't want to fight the inevitable, but you do want to preserve what's worth preserving. If you can see the morphological patterns, your task is to save Western civilization. You must serve as a trustee for what these higher values can survive and how they can preserve future cultural development. This is Spengler's contribution to our story. His insight that political events must be understood within the larger context of cultural cycles, and specifically that democracy is a temporary phase in civilizational development. Thus, a new emergence of new forms of authoritarianism is as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. The question this raises is profound and disturbing. If Spengler is right about the morphology of culture, then what does this mean for anyone who wants to serve higher human values during our coming winter? And what kind of preparation is possible for those who have to live through this transition from democracy to Caesarism? Next time, we're going to look at that and meet someone who took these insights about decline and used them to develop a complete theory of political authority that justifies rule by whoever can make effective decisions during the time of crisis and exception. Thank you.